Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to session 5. Data matters for development, data matters for the Sustainable Development Goals, yet we don't have sufficient disaggregated data really to track and monitor them. Data for policy making, as we all know, has become a buzzword. But you may remember the words of the Swiss president at the opening ceremony of this summit when he said we still need to strengthen national and multilateral data systems. Worryingly, the financing is just not there. It's stagnated. And since the pandemic, it's got worse. Before the pandemic, I think we had half of the amount of money that we needed. So my name is Claire Dool, and I'm your moderator. We're going to be taking questions on the application, also questions from the floor. A microphone will go round. We would really like you to use the hashtag DevCoSummit and tweet, because we've got some great panelists, and I am going to introduce them in a moment. Because we're going to be looking at how we can better support national and multilateral data systems, how we can avoid duplication. We heard in the opening ceremony that that is an issue not just with data, it's with the whole humanitarian aid sector. And indeed, how we can partner to ensure that data makes the vulnerable visible. So we're going to start with Dr. Claire Melamed, who's going to come and join me on stage. Claire is the CEO of the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Thank you, Claire, please. Now, you're a global network. You use data to achieve the SDGs. And on your website, you have a very catchy tagline, better data, better decisions, better lives. So tell us, what is the investment case for data?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. So I think we all know how important data is. We all use data every day. We're all very conscious of using data, whether that's to check a bus timetable or compare prices in the supermarket every day of our lives. And we're also aware, as you said, of some of the really critical areas where gaps in data stop governments, stop civil society organizations, stop companies from doing things that would be good things to do in the world. But it's been difficult to really quantify what is the return on investment in data. And of course, we all know if you're going to make a case for more funding, you have to be able to argue why data should be funded, what's the return on investment, and why fund this rather than something else. So working with the United Nations and the World Bank, we at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data commissioned the research firm Dalberg Associates to look at exactly that. And they pored over all the studies that are available, looked at all of the work that's been done on the return for investment in data, and found that on average, for every $1 that you invest in a data system, you can expect to get $32 back in economic returns. Now, just for comparison, that's an incredibly good rate of return for an investment in a development project. It's equivalent to something like vaccines, which we know are one of the best, the most effective interventions that you can make.
And indeed, we can see that there's a slide there which makes this very clear. Now, when we talk about economic returns, there are also social returns. So what are they?
The point about data is that it allows all the other money to be spent so much more effectively. So if you invest a small amount of money in data, what that means is for the other 99+% of your spending, that money is going much further. So it means that you can really target investments in education on those children that will most need them, as they did, for example, in Guatemala. Or it means that you can really focus your resources on reducing traffic accidents on those few kilometers of road where most accidents happen. And this is what they did in Nairobi to really focus in on the huge problem there of road traffic accidents. So data can give you returns in almost every sector. It just makes all your other money work that bit harder.
And the process has to be right. There has to be the right system in place.
That's right. I mean, data gives you similar returns to vaccines, but unlike vaccines, it can be used again and again. So the point about data is not just to provide a one-off platform that can only be used for one thing, or a single product that governments just sort of receive and can't use again and again. The point about data is to invest in the system. And that then means that those investments can continue paying off and multiplying as more different sources of data are added for years, for decades to come. So it's really all about the system.
Thank you very, very much for making that so clear. And please join us later when I'm really hoping that there'll be some questions from our remote audience and also the audience here in Geneva. Thank you very much. So I'm joined by two people now who really understand the investment case for data. We're delighted to be joined remotely by Shamaka Farah, who's the director of Somalia's National Statistics Bureau. And here in Geneva next to me is Dr. Johannes Jutting, executive director of Paris 21. Now, you may know what that acronym is, but just in case you don't, I'm going to say that it's the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century. And it promotes the better use and production of statistics in the developing world. So, welcome to both of you. Farah, just briefly tell us, what do you need data for and how critical is it for Somalia's development?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but I'm very pleased to be joining this panel of distinguished delegates. And I want to thank also for Claire Malamed for setting the scene. I think she already spoke about the importance of investing in data. Somalia's data needs are really quite enormous, and they range, from the country needing to develop its country and also develop its reconstruct, because Somalia is going through a reconstruction phase after a long civil war, and also we need data for our debt relief process. Somalia has passed the decision point in 2020 and is now planning to complete the completion point of debt relief. So it needs really good macroeconomic data for Somalia to reach the completion point. But more importantly, we need data for the environment, because Somalia has a recurrent drought, and it also has land degradation issues that need to be tackled very well. And all of these endeavors and all of these really milestones require data for planning in order to really deal with these pressing issues that Somalia now faces. So it can't be overstated.
Can't be overstated. And Johannes, data so key there for development, but big concerns about financing. And I think I read an article that said that the success of the SDGs might be under threat because of this lack of financing in data.
Yeah, I think I would fully agree with this statement. I think we need data to measure the SDGs, the international commitment. We need to have data to track progress. And as you said, Claire, and as it has come out, the support for data and statistics, we at Paris 21, we measure this since 10 years now. And it's very meager. It's less than 0.5% of official development aid. So it's something like 600 million per year, US dollars. So it's not enough.
And I read somewhere that, in fact, data for gender equality is even declining. There's less and less of that, even though everybody, of course, talks about the importance of gender equality, but the data's just not there.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, we have found this in our latest analysis. That's indeed, as you say, I mean, the support for gender equality in general has increased, which is a very good thing, but the support for the data production has decreased. So we really have an issue here. But if I may, I also wanted to give it a positive spin. I mean, first of all, that we have here a panel talking about data is something very good, and that the aid effectiveness community takes up this rather complex issue is very good. Second, we have a couple of innovative initiatives, the Burn Network for more and better financing, the clearinghouse where data producers and users, donors can get together. So it's not all bleak. There is some positive development as well. And if I made a last point, is that also countries, Somalia and many African countries, raise more domestic resources for their own production of data. So it's not all bad.
Good, that's good to know. And in fact, our panel will be looking at some of the solutions, not just the financial ones. But Farah, next to you, you may see that there is a slide, and our remote audience will see this, data producing organizations in Somalia. Now, there's a lot of them. Tell us, Farah, how do you coordinate? It looks incredibly fragmented here. And tell us about some of the problems that causes you when everybody wants data from Somalia, but there's just this lack of coordination. What does that mean for you?
Thank you very much for showing this slide. I think really just gets to the heart of the problem. Somalia has, there's enormous outpouring of resources into data generation, but unfortunately, none of it or most of it doesn't make it into official statistics, and mostly because it's not coordinated with the statistical agency. So, and the problem is that these organizations, international organizations, do not share data with each other. So there is a continuous replication, continuous duplication of effort, and that which also leads to a fatigue among respondents and also complaints among these respondents. So and we also are having to spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we coordinate, and catching up is also very, very difficult. The other issues will be with coordinating this is the lack of statistical standards. So yeah, basically, I think we're making a progress. We're making some, progress, but not as much as we had hoped. So it's a clear challenge there.
Yeah. Thank you, Farah. And do stay with us, because we'd like to bring you back into the conversation at the end. Johannes, Farah is talking about the lack of coordination there and the fragmentation. And then sometimes he was telling me earlier that when the international community come in and produce data, there's a lot of skepticism amongst the public. And then his office has to go and verify that data again. So is the case of Somalia specific to Somalia, or do you hear these sort of issues in a more broader context?
It's not specific to Somalia. It's not even specific to African countries. It's not specific to fragile states or countries, low-income countries. We can find these situations all over the world, in poor countries, in Asia and Latin America. So the question is, why is that so? And I think there is the problem to some extent is that we on the one hand have data and need to produce data for international commitments like the SDGs, or for regional commitments like Africa 2063. And then there is data at the national level that decision makers need in Somalia, which is local data. And at times these are not necessarily congruent. So we need to think about ways of how we can overcome this. And the good news is we have some ideas of how to do it. And in some countries, Ghana, but also Rwanda, the governments are very strict with asking donors to align to the national plans, to the national development plans, and to national statistical plans to avoid a situation which we have here. So there are some ways to deal with it, but it's a bit of a complicated issue, yeah.
Excellent. Well, Johannes, we'll come back to you at the end of the conversation where we will look at problems but also solutions. Let me introduce my panel to you. Dr. Harvard Niergaard. That's my Norwegian pronunciation, so we will, I won't say it again, I'll just say Harvard. Deputy Director General and Director of Knowledge at Norway's Development Cooperation Agency, NORAD. Dr. Marina Manka, Head of the Global Migration Data Analysis Center at the Global Data Institute of the International Organization of Migration. Welcome. And Adrian Lovett, CEO of Development Initiatives, an independent international development organization that focuses on the role of data in driving poverty eradication and sustainable development. So let's look at how we're going to address some of the challenges that Farah has mentioned and Johannes has mentioned too. Now, Adrian, your organization has done extensive field research and you have coined the term data disharmony. What we've heard from Farah and Johannes, is that data disharmony?
Yes, there's certainly a lack of harmony there in what we heard. It's not a beautiful song that we want to hear just yet. So, you know, the reason why we talk about data disharmony is because we've all talked in this community, and including right now this week at this summit, rightly about the need for harmonization. And there have been important steps taken over the last couple of decades, but we know we have a long way to go. And the opposite of harmonization is not a sort of a neutral, okay space. It's a problem. It's disharmony, and it's dysfunction, it's duplication, and lack of coordination. For us, you know, there's three dimensions of data disharmony. It's about surveys, it's about systems, and about crises. If we think about surveys, the household survey is the backbone of any data ecosystem in a country. If you look at Zimbabwe, they've had 33 surveys in the last 9 years. Involving 12 different external donors. Only 3 of those 33 surveys have actually produced district-level data that can be used in a really meaningful way
like
at
Farah
a local
said,
level.
Survey fatigue.
Exactly, and looking at that chart that you shared when Farah was speaking, it looks like one of those awful diagrams of how to escape from the hotel room you're in, right? But I have no idea how I'd get out of that one. I would burn in the fire. So, you know, surveys are hugely important, and the multiplicity of them and the lack of interoperability between them is a real problem. The systems then, because that's about how we gather the data, the systems about how we manage and organize the data also suffer from that same problem of duplication and of lack of harmonization. If you take Bangladesh, 2 systems there, one funded by USAID, one funded by UNICEF, large amounts of data that are the same across those 2 systems, but there's some unique data in each of them, but that isn't read across into the other system. So the systems overlap, but they're not interoperable. And the final thing in terms of crises, we know that in humanitarian emergencies, there's a need to move fast, and there's a need for data quickly. And that's why, in some ways, it's understandable that the humanitarian community has had to create, it's had to create its own systems for gathering and managing data. But the typical humanitarian crisis now lasts for more than 9 years. So we can't really allow that sense of exceptionalism, that sense, well, this is a disaster, so we've got to move fast. Yes, of course, we'd have to move fast, but we have to move in a way that's consistent with true ownership at the local level and, crucially, at the government level in the countries that we're talking about in order for us to see an end to that kind of disharmony that we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Marina, of course, migration. My goodness, the world has a migration crisis at the moment. What is your organization doing to try and tackle some of these issues that we've heard about duplication, fragmentation, and the lack of coordination?
So much. Actually, I could not but agree to everything that has been shared right now. And that really is concerning because our organization is very unique in the UN system. We are projectized. And I think when we speak about financing for data, it's also important to speak about responsible financing. So very often it's really up to the donor who is allocating funding to really bring up that requirement of ensuring that there's synergy. But being a projectized organization, of course, we are on the ground, we are really up there. Whenever there is a situation emerges, Somalia, we have a big team actually working there. An interesting exercise where we have worked with our data collectors. As you're saying, we need to be there because when the situation starts evolving, we need to be aware about the needs of the population and the mood. But what we are trying to do is really try to, first of all, align all the different data collection exercises globally that we are implementing, start moving towards standardization, but also partner with different UN organizations like UNHCR. We have an agreement right now, but also go beyond those who are working in human mobility, but looking for complementarities with the data collection systems of other sectors, for instance, employment, education, because those surveys, they are collecting information on population, and of course they are also capturing migrant population on the move. So how can we all work together? And ahead of this meeting, we had a coordination discussion with UN partners. There's a lot to be done. Secretary General has come up with the data strategy, which is advocating for the synergy, for the focus on capacity development. The question is really, how do you do that today and in a specific location?
So you are coordinating all of the data from the international organizations. Are you also getting data which is from the private sector, citizen-generated data, data from civil society?
I think what is important, and we already mentioned, that the differentiation between statistics and operational data. So it's absolutely crucial to be aware and strengthen the statistical systems, the statistical offices. But there's a lot of data which is collected out there, which is not yet compliant with the statistical requirements, but it still tells us some story, maybe not nationally representative, but representative of a specific community. So what we are advocating for is for data triangulation. It's basically pooling data and triangulating operational data, data from surveys, from the census, from the big data, from the private sector. One of our brand initiative, which is really creating a lot of impact on the ground and changing lines of migrants, is Missing Migrants Initiative. SDG indicator on the number of migrants who are dying on the route is becoming very, very right now important. What we are doing is we are pooling, crowdsourcing data from different information. It's not statistics, but it's the data which is creating an impact, which is driving behavior change.
And of course, it's important to coordinate this not only in European capitals, but on the ground. And the UN system has now UN resident coordinators in place. I mean, do you see a role for them as the gatekeepers to ensure that there isn't duplication and that national development data needs are met?
Absolutely. The role of UN country teams is crucial. So, because that's where we all come in together and discussing multiple things. We are working with the governments to develop their development programs for the years to come. And data is an enabler of effective, efficient responses, the way how Claire spoke about today. If we have data investment, so then we are actually improving efficiency and effectiveness of all other interactions. So the systems, the national data development, the statistical data systems plans, the coordinator role within the team, but also allowing for iterative innovation, not necessarily over bureaucratization. That is also very important, as we spoke about in crisis. It's important to act fast, but as long as we are sharing information, coming together, I think we are powerful.
Adrian, any reflections on what Marina has said?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there is a role for the UN resident coordinator to play, as Marina said. I think also, most countries have a development partner forum of some sort or another that is led by the government, that is there to coordinate partners. In many cases, they're more of a kind of a formality, or at least a sort of a kind of heavy with protocols. Let's put it that way. And yet, a reboot of that function in a country, led by a government that really wants to and is empowered to pull together those external partners, and backed by regional bodies such as the African Union in Africa's case and so on, could be a really exciting way to properly locate the ownership and the leadership of the process in the right place, and bring everyone to the table in a single conversation. It seems to us that that might help as well.
Harvard, I think Marina referred to this, that really the donors perhaps need to play a role here and incentivize international organizations that they do collaborate and that they do coordinate. So what incentives are there?
So thanks, Claire, and I'll get to that question, but let me just start by pointing to three things. First, I want to pick up on that I think is an important part of this conversation. So Johannes mentioned how good it is that we're finally talking about data at the Aid Effectiveness Summit. I think that's absolutely critical, and we're extremely happy to see data finally getting its proper spot in this agenda. It is important for Norwegian development assistance that everything we do is evidence-based. You can't do effective development cooperation without being evidence-based, and you can't be evidence-based without collecting data. So for us, that is the full circle, and we need to make data a bigger part of this agenda. And then, we've talked a little bit about the importance of data for reaching the SDGs. I think it is, unfortunately, the brutal hard truth at the moment that we're not on track to reach the SDGs, quite on the contrary, actually. So the big question then, right, is who gets left behind and where do we actually focus our efforts? And if we're going to do that in a focused effort and actually reach those most in need, then data becomes even more important. And thirdly, and then I promise I'll get to the question, we talked a little bit about humanitarian crises, etc. Already. It's also, I think, clear now, increasingly clear to everyone that as we are increasingly seeing the effects of climate change, a lot of the stuff that we do, a lot of the context we work in, will grow increasingly unpredictable. They will be environments that are increasingly hard to work in. That essentially means that we're going to have to invest even more in data simply to achieve the same results as we are achieving today. But we need to achieve more results, meaning that we need even more and even better investment in data. So,
and even more effective coordination that you have to incentivize.
Yes.
Indeed.
Yes, absolutely. This is where, so we're extremely happy to have entities, organizations such as Paris 21 that does, important work on coordinating the multilateral organizations. We are, trying to do the little bit that we can to ensure harmonization, coordination across the multilaterals. I think it's fair to say that it's a bit concerning now to see, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of initiatives that are, to some extent overlapping and to some extent pulling in different directions.
You have your own slide, like Farah has a slide there. You have your own overlapping Venn diagram.
And there is, so one thing is coordination within the UN. Another thing is coordination, across the UN, the World Bank, just to say two things. So I don't have the answer, basically, for that. It's just to say that I think we have a way to go before we actually handle and coordinate that in an effective manner.
Let's move on then. You mentioned the Bern call to action, or we at least heard the Swiss president saying yesterday how important it was to strengthen national statistical offices. Tell us, for you, how important it is and what you do at NORAD to make sure that that happens, that there is coordination there at least at a national level.
Yeah, so for us, statistical capacity building, and especially building the capacity of the National Statistical Office, is absolutely crucial for sustainable development. It is, so I don't know if you know this, but the oldest continuously existing state agency in the world is the Swedish National Statistical Office, and there's a reason why that's the case, right? Data is not a nice thing to have in addition to everything else the state does. It is it's an absolutely critical government function. It is a core government function, but we very often don't talk about it as a core government function. It is also an absolutely core feature well-functioning, accountable, democratic system. You can't hold policymakers, decision makers accountable if you don't have trusted, reliable data that has to come from somewhere, and ideally it should come from the National Statistical Office. So in our broad development programs, we see, the very small funding that we actually spend on this, but the small money that we spend on National Statistical Office building as perhaps one of the most important ingredients in the big development mix, or whatever you want to call it.
Why do you think that it's just not attractive to fund national statistics offices?
Well, I don't think it's that it's not attractive. It just, there's a lot of other needs that always seems more pressing. So investing in national statistical capacity is the quintessential example of a thing that gives you very little impact here now. It is a long-term investment. So the 1 to 32 business case that Claire laid out, that won't materialize tomorrow or next week. That's a more of a long-term gambit. So it's very easy to start with all of the other stuff. And down prioritize capacity building, but that gives you less impact over not just the long term, but the medium term.
And of course, it's all about country ownership, which
Yep.
is one of the principles of this summit. I mean, Marina, when you do collect data from a country, are you also strengthening the country's national statistics system?
Absolutely. So actually, what we are doing within the organization is right now we are bringing different data initiatives together. I spoke about data collection that we do in the context of humanitarian crisis, displacement tracking metrics, which is out there to collect, help governments to collect data complementary. But there is a Global Migration Data Analysis Center, which I represent, part of the Global Data Institute, which is doing nothing but capacity development of statistical systems, and not necessarily only statistical offices, because for us, statistical system is also availability of administrative data, which is telling the story complementary to surveys and census on our population groups, on migrants, on foreigners.
Administrative data,
Data
as in births,
sources like
marriages.
civil registrations, border management statistics, issuance of permits. So what we are advocating for is to create support statistical offices by ensuring that they also understand the potential of extracting and creating knowledge based on those additional data sources. Together with big data and other innovative data sources, empowering statistical offices. So for us, otherwise, we will not be able to tell the story of human mobility because migrants are usually left behind because they are in a regular status and they are not captured by statistical. So indeed, we have training programs. We have also doing assessments. We are bringing statistical office representatives to International Migration Statistics Forum in Chile. Every few years, we're organizing that together with OECD and with EDESA. So everything. So we're trying to support from our angle together with UN organizations. So, but the amount of work to be done is so huge that probably it might look like a drop in the ocean.
Adrian, can you reflect on what you've heard from Harvard and Marina on strengthening the national systems?
Well, I think we just have to be really clear about the task that we've got here. I mean, if we look at Africa, just a half of births are registered. Only 1 in 3 deaths are registered. That's hugely important to build a health system, to know why people died. And so the investment that's needed, and our team have looked at this, and our sense is that there could be something really exciting in a compact where external partners commit to fund the capital investment needed to build these systems, and governments commit to fund the ongoing cost of maintaining them. That would put ownership in the right place. It would bring resources into one coordinated approach. And if, take a country like South Sudan, where our team did some work just a few months ago, looking at their data ecosystem. If you could invest properly in a digital transformation of data gathering and analysis in primary healthcare facilities, in education, in primary schools, and in birth registration. If you get those 3 pieces right, you start to have the beginnings of a really powerful ecosystem of data. But at the moment, taking that example from South Sudan, and of course every country is different, there's no typical country in Africa or anywhere else, but in the case of South Sudan, what our team found was that bluntly, the international community didn't trust the government to be able to create and manage the data that needed, and the government saw the international community subverting their systems. And one way or another, we've got to fix that problem.
Yeah, indeed. One of the main themes of this summit is building back trust, indeed. Harvard, I saw that you were nodding as Adrian was talking about what could be done there.
I think both Adrian and Marina touched on an important feature of this. So, we talk about strengthening national statistical capacity, and I think it's critical that is, the National Statistical Office is obviously one integral and extremely important feature, part of that. But the statistical ecosystem of a country has to be broader. It has to include other entities as well. So the multilaterals have an extremely important role to play there. Academic organizations, think tanks, civil society. Let's take a topic such as human rights data, right? I'm so speaking personally now for myself. I don't want my human rights data from Norway to come from the state. Some data should actually come from other organizations, civil society organizations, independent organizations, and they have to be part of a mutually reinforcing national statistical ecosystem.
Johannes.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on this point about coordination and what we can do about it. And to some extent, I'm now 10 years in this business, and I have to say we can also, as Paris 21 aims to help international organizations to coordinate, we can, for different reasons, can go so far. So if that is the case, what is maybe another approach or a parallel approach that we could take? And I think this is strengthening local actors. I mean, I heard that yesterday there was the discussion about local development and the initiative by Norway and the US. And I think that's something strengthening local systems. And let me give you a very practical example. One of my colleagues just went to the Dominican Republic where we organized a leadership seminar for female statisticians and from female senior leaders in statistics. And so empowerment of the local actors and have them a say. And our colleague in Somalia, I mean, if through leadership training, they will be able to be on the same page in conversations with the donors, because there are in countries, there are institutions, there are places where you can discuss those things. And it's often the case, as we know, that international bureaucrats are often well-trained. They are used to sit on panels like here. And this is, at times, people are not so comfortable coming in those conversations. So I think this empowerment, leadership is something that we should more support. It's not very costly, but I think it's very effective. And to have a discussion on pair and then find a good compromise for a given country, because it's too easy to say the international organizations often, I mean, like we heard, they collect data for very good reasons, but they collect data for international comparative purpose. They need one data point from Somalia, and then they put it in a big database for having a nice report from New York on international comparative things, about things that really matter. But on the same time, we need local data, we need actionable, granular data for Somalia to be able to action. And I think that's the key issue that we need to get into.
Yeah. Before I go to audience questions, and we'll hear back from Farah and Johannes at the end, I wanted to touch upon the idea of course, leaving no one behind, making the vulnerable visible, which of course you can do with data, but often they're not counted or they're underrepresented. So let's look at some innovative approaches, because as Marina, you will know, migrants, especially if they've got an uncertain legal status, they're difficult to reach. So how do you reach them?
Honestly, this is something you spoke about, international numbers. The numbers we have on migrants, 280 million, is actually telling nothing about the real human mobility story. So yes, this is collected, but we need much more information to be to understand, because migrants, they have different stories behind. They're joining their families, they're going to study, so they're fleeing conflicts. So the variety of data needs, as you're completely right. In Somalia, we are implementing program on supporting return of diaspora, coming back doctors and supporting the development of the health sector. So we need to be sophisticated. So first of all, the variety needs to be there to be able to tell the story. But very often migrants, as I mentioned already earlier, they are afraid they're in a regular undocumented, and it's so challenging to capture this population group. So we are joining the call of leaving no one behind, and for us, migrants and displaced population groups are really among the most vulnerable categories. If you add also female migrants together, or children on the move, we have an international alliance for data on children on the move. That's how we are trying to coordinate within the UN system. So what do we do? The key response answer is work towards better disaggregation. So we even have a guide. So we need to capture, as per indicator of SDG, better way of capturing, disaggregating by migratory status in administrative data, in the civil registration. So, and we actually are grateful for the funding. We are initiating a new global program funded by the German government to look into the gender and the youth. The youth and young migrants and female migrants will be our target moving forward. Hopefully we'll have something positive to tell very soon to everyone.
Adrian, what sort of innovative approaches have you seen to really collecting the data, but of course involving these groups as well in the design of the surveys or the censuses and producing it, that can really reach the vulnerable groups, whether they're women, children, migrants? There are many.
Well, I think one thing that we touched a little bit on this, one thing that clearly makes a difference is to look beyond official data, to look at how private sector data can be used, and crucially civil society generated data, which often does reach the hardest to reach by the nature of that sector, and too often the data that is generated there sits separate from a nationally coordinated approach. So the best examples I think our team have seen of where those have been brought together, but there's been great leadership on this agenda, including from Norway, from Switzerland as well, our hosts here in Geneva, who've shown terrific leadership on this kind of thinking around innovation. And Claire actually as well, if there's time, moderator, we'd love to hear more from Claire on this, because the way the Global Partnership has been thinking about this, I think, is really innovative as well.
Well, in fact, we'll go to audience questions in a moment, and if you'd like to take the microphone, Claire, you're most welcome. Harvard, just to come back from a donor's point of view, Adrian was giving you a bit of praise there, but just as a donor, in terms of closing these data gaps in leaving no one behind, what are you doing and what can you commit to doing more of?
Well, so we have a data for development program that we want to invest more in, that we want to make a bigger, more integral, a larger part of our development portfolios in general, without being in a position now to put a number or a figure on it. But we are seeing this as, you know, when we do, so we're going through an exercise now where we're looking at all our portfolios, looking at basically the theory of change for all of the portfolios, and again we see that the statistical capacity, the data, has been a missing link in many of them, and we need to invest more in that, regardless of the substantive aim you want to meet. And I think that's one part of it, and I think related to that as well is, you know, so now we talk a lot about the data per se, but it's also a question of analysis, right? So who has the capacity to analyze the data? That's interesting when you come from a locally led development perspective, making sure that as part of the national statistical ecosystem, there's actually the expertise needed to analyze the data properly and to use that data to influence public debate, to lay the premises, and to ensure, you know, high quality governance is also super important in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just that you're collecting data from them, but you're helping them design the processes and the analysis and the production. I would very much like to hear from our audience in the room. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Thank you, the lady in the pink jacket. I think Ida will go round with a microphone, I'm hoping. And then we're going to go to somebody online. So we're going to mix and match between the audience in the room and the audience online. We hope we'll have time for Dr. Claire Melamed to come to us. And I would like to also give the floor at the end back to Farah and Johannes. Please say who you're from. And if it's a question, tell us it's a question. If it's a comment, just paraphrase it so we know it's a comment and I don't interrupt you.
Thank you at first, thank you for organizing this event and very interesting topic, which is the crucial for any country, including my country. I represent Georgia. I represent Prime Minister's office, and I'm the head of the strategic planning unit, which works in policy documents of the country, as well as we're leading the process of SDG nationalization and implementation process. And of course, the data is quite a challenging issue in my country as well. So you mentioned, the speakers mentioned that we shouldn't be rely on only statistic office, country statistic office, but we have to use the sources from think tank of non-governmental organization. I agree with you, but for instance, in my country, we don't have many opportunities to use the other sources, as they do not produce the data regularly. They're producing only for 2 or 3 years, or sometimes they are just quitting the producing of any data, and we are not able to measure the progress in a long-term periods. For example, there is one example. We have a SDG national document on a country level, and we use some data that was produced from international organization, as well as, for example, the National Democratic Institute, you know, which is quite a...
so you're wanting some advice from the speakers?
I have just a question. So we're using the data from also very popular kind of organization, but they quit producing this data. What would be your recommendation? How can we rely on that kind of organization if we don't use the sources only from Statistical Office? What would be the recommendation from you in that case?
Okay. Anybody on the panel, Adrian or perhaps Johannes, as the thinkers from these organizations, please.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, at least it's good to be called a thinker anyway. So, in terms of your question...
Microphone, please.
Question, and of course, as we, Paris 21, we work with national statistical offices, and we work...
Mic for the speaker, please. Microphone, please.
I think one of the key points here is the quality of the data. I think it's with the data we have to think it's not about the right data or the wrong data, it's the methodology and it's the quality and the purpose for what. So I'm pretty sure also actually one of my colleagues is from Georgia, and we have a relationship to that country as well. And what I can see is that there is first of all also an interest from the government to be open to use data either from the private sector or from civil society organizations. So that's the first, that's a very sort of condition for engaging into a dialogue between the different data providers. So the first thing is to be open for that. Second is there are quality frameworks that are established, which would go into a bit more technical conversations to be able to use that data. And then third, I think there's one aspect that we haven't really talked about so much, but which is also very important, is the use of the data. It's not often, I mean, we talk basically about data production here, so far very important, but then we also have data graveyards. In reality, we have lots of data that is locked in some Excel sheets or on PDF documents. It's not readable, it's not open. So to open up that data is also crucial, and then to have it used. So maybe these are just my quick answers here, and we can happy to have
absolutely. I can see that
later.
We can connect there. Adrian, anything to add? Otherwise, I'll go to, I think we've got some questions online. Okay, yes, Ida is going to read out one of the questions that we have, and if there's a specific person on the panel, please tell us.
Thanks, Claire. There's quite a few questions, and
give us
they
one.
range. So the first one, I think it can go to Farah, and maybe some colleagues also on the panel, around the governance and legislative frameworks around data management in national statistical systems, and kind of what progress is being made in that space for trust in the data.
Okay, let's just take that one, because I've got a short-term memory. Farah, did you hear that question? Please give a response.
Yeah, Somalia has actually made a significant progress in the governance and the legislative side of the Statistical Act. So since independence, Somalia has always had a statistical agency.
What a shame.
And within the planning. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I was worried that you'd frozen. Please carry on.
Sure, sure. So, but in 2020, a new law came into effect, and this actually had the support of international partners, including the World Bank and the IMF. So the Statistics Agency was actually made independent, and we now have a board, an independent board that is made up of civil society, academia, professors, and the like. So we have an independent, board that's overseeing the technical aspect of our work. So that's really quite a major achievement, and this has also actually sort of facilitated our work with the partners, and has been very, very useful for us to. If you like, even yeah, I mean,
it's been an achievement that you say.
To be pressured by anybody. It is a major achievement. Yeah.
Absolutely. Ida, another question.
So the next question is on domestic resource mobilization. Could the panelists provide any inputs on what is needed to help countries mobilize and increase their own funding for developing national data and statistical systems?
Okay, how do they get more funding? What are the incentives? How do we make it attractive? There we are, Marina.
Let me try, maybe. I understand, so how do we make the case for national investment into data, local investment into data? And honestly, we were just preparing and discussing very often, indeed, we spoke about data production, collection, which is boring. I've been working on data in the migration since 2004, and back then nobody understood the value of data. Everybody, statistics is very boring, it's really not interesting. We need to be coming together and really making the case. It's not about data, it's about analysis, about demonstrating this $1 into 32. We really need to make the case, and I think this is where organizations like yours can help us, because very often technical people are speaking about, so the parliamentarians who allocate the budget need to be clear about what they get out of that. And once we crack that, I think we'll get more resources.
Adrian?
Yeah, I think the emphasis on use is absolutely right. Yep. We've got to be ensuring that, you don't just ask the community health worker to extract the information that you need for your data system. You put back into that health worker's hands.
They have to see the impact
in
indeed.
Context and the ability to compare against other facilities and so on. So I think the use point is bang on. I think the other thing maybe is around just status within government. There are countries that we've looked at, that our team has looked at, where the statistics office is in the constitution. It's enshrined in the president's office. It's got a great status. But in practice, it hasn't worked out like that, and it's buried at some sub-level in a ministry somewhere. I think, in answer to the question, it's not so different from anything else that we want to raise resources for, whether domestically or internationally. You have to have the political leadership. You have to have the stories being told at the highest level, from governments to people, among people, between private sector and people and so on. The stories of how this data ecosystem is so critical to people's lives in a real human way are what's missing, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Ida, is there another question from the online audience?
There's one that's a bit provocative.
Well, let's have it.
So
and then I'm going to go to somebody who's in front of me, and then I'm going to go to Claire Melamed, and we'll most probably have some final remarks from Johannes and Farah.
Yeah,
Go
so
on.
there's a debate about the lack of ODA financing for national statistical systems, and a question to the panel, and it may fall upon the donor in the group, whether there should in fact be some form of target or ring fencing of ODA, whether that sort of incentive would work for mobilizing more resources for this core government function. Thanks.
There we are.
Yeah. I guess that's definitely an interesting idea. So, the stuff that we really prioritize, we always put a target on, right? We want to double climate finance, we want this much for that, or blah, blah, blah. So assuming we actually care about strengthening statistical capacity, which we do, then, obviously, you understand this is not the official Norwegian policy, but to me at least, that seems like an excellent idea. Yep. Okay. Otherwise, because we get back to it's the same as the question of how do you ensure domestic resource mobilization. It is hard to prioritize something that for so long is going to have such an intangible effect. So maybe that's a case for putting a dollar target on it.
Yeah, absolutely. The person who had her hand up was right in front of me. Thank you. The microphone is all yours.
No, thank you so much. I'm Valencia Uiras. I'm from Namibia, from the National Planning Commission. My question was, in fact, similar to the previous one, before the last one, but maybe asking it the other way around. Government has really canvassed a lot of resources. We are about to conduct our national census, but then we've just found it a bit difficult to also get development partners to support us in really augmenting government resources. So what type of story do we need to tell them? Because I thought that there's a mutual understanding that statistics are important, but maybe because of also our classification as a country, we find it really challenging to get development partners to also assist us in augmenting government resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take that question? Thought.
I mean,
Adrian.
I would appeal to the sense of return on investment, the interest in return on investment. That Claire talked about. If the wider set of stakeholders here properly sign up to that understanding of the extraordinary return on investment in statistics, then it's a no-brainer. Then you follow the money, and I think it's making that case to donors. But perhaps what I was mentioning earlier as well, the notion that our team have explored a little bit of external stakeholders funding capital investments and governments undertaking to ensure that those investments are then properly used by good maintenance of systems going forward might be a good breakdown of labour there.
Dr. Melamed, there we are. We've trailed you, so the floor is yours, either to make a comment or if you have a question.
Thank you so much. No, what a great discussion. I had a few things. I was just writing notes as you were going. So let me see. I have two things, maybe 2.5 things to say. I mean, the first of all, just in response to that last question, if there's one piece of data that governments need, it's the census. It's the most basic thing of all. If you don't know how many people are in your country, how can you start? So if there's one thing that needs supporting in terms of building up foundational data systems, really it should be that. I really feel as a community we have to do better. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think this ring fencing point is really interesting and very encouraged by your points, although not the official position, about the logic of that. Because, I mean, it does seem to me, and it's kind of responding to a comment that you made earlier also, Vard, it seems to me the point here is partly about saying, you know, let's designate a kind of specific area of funding and call it data for development and increasing finance there. But I think the logic of a lot of the other things that have been said has also been about incorporating funding for data in other programs. So it's not necessarily about let's create a specific thing, although there are some areas of funding that you might need that for. But a lot of what we've been hearing about is also the way that sometimes when donors incorporate data into the funding for other programs, they do that sometimes in a way that can actually undermine the system. So if they're funding 33 surveys in Zimbabwe in 9 years through a health program, an education program, whatever else, they're funding data in a way that is actually called health or education, and in a way that's undermining the system. So could we find some way of ring-fencing a proportion of all of the sector level spending and spending it in a way that supports the system? It may be that actually what we're talking about is partly an increase in funding for data, but a lot of it might also be about reallocating donor funding for data so that it's spent in a much more efficient and sustainable way over the long term and actually building the system while also at the same time collecting the data that governments need. And if you look at the investment case that was done by Dolberg, it suggests that if you spent 0.8% of all ODA in that way, you'd actually cover the data gap calculated by Paris 21 for data systems, and you'd make the other 99.2% of the spend so much more efficient. So
Thank you, Claire.
There are ways to do that. Thank you.
Great. I am going to bring this discussion to an end by going back to Johannes for a key takeaway and to Farah for a key takeaway. Johannes.
Very quickly, 3 key takes away. Very, very quickly. So first is great to have this conversation, Claire, and thanks for the organizers. I think it was a fantastic discussion that we have here. We also saw it's complex. There's no easy solution, but it's good to have this. And one additional thought to this question of narrative. The Club of Rome has issued recently a report about the state of world and what can be done. And they argue in that report that the most fundamental question that we as humanity have to address is not climate change, it's not all the other issues that we talk daily about, but it's about facts versus fiction. That parts of the population all over this world wouldn't be able to agree on anything in terms of what we understand as evidence-based, because all our understanding, it's all on data, facts, evidence, better policies, better lives, right? But if we are not able to convince them through, for instance, data, we will not go that far. So I think this trust, disinformation, misinformation, fake news is a key part of that conversation, the governance part, basically. Second, very quickly, donor better. We had a couple of good ideas here, how the Bern Compact, how donors can spend aid in this sector much better. But we also learned that about domestic resource mobilization and the questions about how countries can mobilize more resources themselves. And last but not least, I think that's the main one key takeaway, innovation, innovation, innovation. We have a couple of exciting things heard from the countries, but also Bern Network, Clearinghouse, other things. So I think this is very good, and we should just go forward with that.
Yeah. And Farah, your key message then to the audience here in Geneva and the many people who are joining us remotely.
Thank you very much, Claire. Before I actually remark on my key takeaways, I just want to thank the great panelists for their remarks. And I want to also just sort of comment and clarify for Johannes and Harvard about a couple of points that they've made. So one is related to the international comparison and so on. Actually, in Somalia, most of the international partners, what they collect, the data they collect is for projects that they are implementing in Somalia. And the international agencies, actually, international UN agencies actually ask for, SDG indicators from their headquarters. So, for example, Somalia in FAO has a very big, food security data collection exercise in Somalia, but the Rome office requests, data that is related to agriculture indicators, which we have to now go back to their local office in Somalia, the Somalia FAO office, to analyze this and so on. So those are some of the issues. And the other point is about governance statistics, state effectiveness, human rights. Obviously, that should be done by civil society, non-governmental organizations. I just fully agree that is where it belongs. I just want to, my key takeaway is really about, government, ownership, or data ownership. It is really effective, data collection, analysis, and dissemination is the cornerstone of state building and state capacity. The level of national statistical capacity is a good indicator of the state effectiveness. The more the government is able to produce reliable data, the more likely it is to make the right decisions and also thereby effectively serve its citizens. Official statistics also promotes government accountability and ownership, and facilitates also government effective response and solutions. And also, it increases the national commitment and political will to sort of contribute to development. And we've also, all of these good virtues have been made by successive aid development declarations or aid effectiveness declarations. That is the Paris, Accra, and the last one in Busan. Have also underscored the virtues of the importance of ownership and especially in a fragile context.
So Farah, data ownership is your key message. Yes, I don't want to lose our audience because we're just closing here.
Correct.
Data ownership, innovation.
Data ownership that's right. Thank
and
you very
a
much.
world where there's real facts for evidence and not alternative facts. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions. Really, our speakers, I think that there should be a lot of tweets out there and articles written on the importance of better data for better policies and better livelihoods. Thank you very, very much, everybody.